the Global Innovation Forum's webinar series, What's Next? And this is a great chance that we've now run for a couple of years, and it's a chance to bring back some of the great speakers that we've had in the past and re-engage with them, and Bruce is one of those, and tee up some of the new voices that you'll be able to hear at the conference in September as well. And yesterday kicked off with Caitlin Kalinowski, the head of hardware at Oculus, which was fascinating, great talk from Caitlin. And tomorrow we've got Xenia Tata, who I'll say a little bit more about at the end, but is the Chief Impact Officer at X Prize. So moonshot thinking, you know, that's all the big SpaceX stuff, Virgin Galactic. But to turn our attention to today, I'm delighted to welcome Bruce Daisley. And Bruce is going to be talking to us about what must be one of the hottest topics of the moment, which is about workplace culture and rebuilding workplace culture in a kind of post-COVID, or a living with COVID maybe is a better phrase, world. Now, for those of you who don't know Bruce, he's a best-selling author, he's a technology leader, spent 12 years running Twitter in Europe and previously YouTube in the UK. And it was sort of during that time that he started to turn his attention to sort of workplace culture. And I think genuinely Bruce is now one of the most respected thought leaders on this topic area, both workplace culture and the future of work. Now, some of you may know him from his excellent podcast, a real must listen, Eat, Work and Repeat, or his book, again, sat on my bookshelf, The Joy of Work. And recently, I haven't yet got to it, Bruce, but your Audible original, No Office Required, which I think has already been in the top 10 on its release in January this year. Your work's been in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Harvard Business Review, amongst many others. And we were delighted to welcome you in person to GIF back in sort of what seems like a lifetime ago, 2019. So it's great to reconnect today. And yeah, welcome you back to the Global Innovation Forum. So I hope this finds you well.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you know, more than anything, I want to chat. I want to pick your brains as well, sort of get your perspective on. Look, you know, while I might be someone trying to document this and sort of capture what's going on, you're running a business, and actually you're dealing with some of these issues in real time. And in fact, you know, I chatted to you on my podcast a few months ago, and I chatted to you last week in preparation for this. So it's always enlightening to sort of to get a full perspective of opinion. So great to have this opportunity to chat to you.
Absolutely. No, well, and we'll run this as a conversation for those attendees. But please do use the chat to both introduce yourselves to other people sort of in the group there, but also to fire in questions as we go, because we want to make this a conversation between Bruce and myself. And also, though, again, this is something we're all living through, both as maybe as employers, maybe as employees, maybe as parts of teams that are pulling in different directions. So, as I say, it's a hot topic. So, Bruce, I mean, just do you mind giving us the sort of what you feel maybe is the lay of the land? Tee this up for us, and then you can fire questions at me as well about what brand genetics are doing, perhaps, and take it from there.
Well, I think broadly, you know, I found myself as someone who'd written about the joys of office culture and sort of trying to create powerful team dynamics. I suspect there's probably been 12 months now, probably maybe 14 months, where it's been dawningly obvious that we weren't necessarily going back to the way that work used to be. And you know, there's been various stages of grief, denial, bargaining along the way there, where I think, you know, a few of us have said, well, maybe we need some elements of the way that we used to work to maximize our sense of innovation or collaboration, or those moments where ideas spontaneously invent themselves, imagine themselves in our midst. And it's been sort of, it's really interesting to watch the stages of this. I think had we taken stock in maybe January this year, there was broadly a consensus that we were going to go back to a hybrid model that was probably an enforced 3 days a week, 4 days a week in the office. And, you know, I think the one thing that was pretty evident at the time was that the feeling that to maximize the network effect, there was going to have to be some tracks laid down. And so, you know, I think you and I have spoken about this, but, you know, it didn't escape a whole load of businesses that they felt that maybe some orderly mandating of certain days for certain teams, or a mandating of office-wide situations was going to be the ideal solution. And the really interesting thing is just watching how that has actually played out when it's been exposed to the direct public opinion of workers who had it suggested to them. And, you know, we've seen some evident examples of this. Apple a few weeks ago. I always caveat talking about tech firms by saying it's not necessarily the fact that they are representative of the rest of us, but they are in their own way the most famous businesses in the world. So we often see a light shone on these firms, not necessarily because any of us might regard ourselves as doing a job equivalent of Apple, but rather, you know, we get a spotlight into the biggest company in the world and we can see what's playing out. And what happened was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I documented this as it played out on a newsletter that I write each week. And what happened was a group of employees, about 80 of them wrote the letter. It represented around 3,000 Apple employees, wrote a letter to Tim Cook saying that the company's proposed solution for them, which was mandated Monday, Tuesday, Thursday in the office, they were entitled to do what they wanted with Wednesday and Friday. They went back and said, this isn't right for us. This isn't adequate for us. It's really interesting, actually, because we've seen in the past examples, just at the very end of Steve Jobs' time at Apple, we've seen examples of Apple doing some things that illustrated how they felt about probably the dominant trends at the time. So at the time, Apple built this remarkable new purpose-built construction, one infinity loop in Cupertino. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the engineers, when they first went in and they saw these sort of vast open plan floor plates, they said, we're not going to work in that. We cannot do our work when we're beset with so many interruptions. And I think broadly, it's that sense that so many of us weren't happy with the big open plan floor plates we were on, that has produced this sense that, okay, working from home has got some pretty huge downsides to it, but we felt like at times we've been able to get more of our work done than we could when we were in sort of a boisterous and noisy Marrakesh market of the office. So I think, you know, a lot of people now are right in the zone where we're wondering what comes next. And, you know, because if we thought that this proposed solution to our employees was this orderly, maybe sort of slight scaffolding of a certain number of days in the week, now that seems like it's getting a really bad response. We've seen other organizations doing it. And as a consequence of that, I think we're in a zone where a lot of organizations are trying to work out what comes next. And what I would describe it is that broadly, you know, that there are low-level battles, debates, discussions ongoing here. I've been really taken with the organizations that seem to be thriving in this zone are the ones that say there isn't going to be one size fits all. And so if they've got one team who say we fancy spending 3 days a week together in the office, but another team that says, you know, in the main, we're going to be mainly working from home, but coming together when these experiential moments of sharing, or these team, you know, we're closing the month financially, or whatever it might be, and they're going to do those things in each other's company. And I've witnessed, I was working with one big retailer up in the Northwest, and they said, look, you know, we've got 60 different teams. There's 60 different proposed solutions, and what we've decided is they're all right. And actually, if we reach a situation where in 12 months' time, Team A, who were a very maverick, slightly more home-based, remote-based setup, have thrived in comparison to Team W, then we hope that becomes self-evident for everyone, that everyone should be trying to channel a bit more of that energy. So I think we're very much in the zone at the moment where people are trying to work it out. The CIPD, I chatted to the membership secretary of the CIPD, a brilliantly thoughtful guy called David D'Souza on my podcast. And I chatted to him and he said, look, if he was going to characterize the way that they are talking, so they're the organization of HR professionals. And he said, if I was going to characterize the advice we're giving to our members is that now's a time for experiments, not a time for decisions. So now's a time, I think most of us recognize. My sister this morning sent me the number of cases in Birmingham right now, which is a sort of hair-raising number. And most people would recognize that we're not really sure what's going to happen next month. We're really not sure what's going to happen in 3 months. And so as a consequence, it's probably a time to mark this down as a learning period rather than one where we're sort of resolute in a determination to get people back to some degree of order ASAP. So, I guess the answer is, to your big question, the answer is uncertainty.
Yeah.
Really. I'd love to know your perspective, actually. So when I chatted to you, I think we were between lockdowns.
It was last summer. Yeah.
Yeah. And could you just give me a perspective how the thinking has evolved and how you as a leader have set about trying to curate that?
Oh, yes. I can give you a perspective, and I'll be, interested to hear yours and the group's view on that. I mean, Brand Genetics, so we're an insight and innovation consultancy. We're about 20 strong. We've actually got an office in Brazil, as well as London, which is our HQ. And I mean, there have been some really interesting things that have come about from going fully remote, as we've pretty much done. One has been actually we've become much more integrated with our Brazilian colleagues. Silver linings and all that. And I think whilst we always had flexibility because we were global, we were traveling, I was in New York at least once a month, if not, another part of the world, we had colleagues everywhere. So I think that the important thing for us was we always had trust in our employees, in our team, that they were going to do a great job, whether they were, in New York or whether they were, in Brazil. Out of sight didn't necessarily mean, that we didn't trust them to do their job. And I think that was really sort of foundational for us when this period kind of struck. Now, what was interesting was it didn't take long, probably 6 months or so, and there became a building of momentum, not so much from the older, of which I absolutely class myself, members of the team, but from some of the younger members of the team, to get back together in the office. And this was sort of building probably when I spoke to you last in the August, and Boris here was urging us to go back into the offices at that point, and we were starting to encourage people to do that, not by mandating anything, but by occasionally laying on a sort of free lunch or things like that. And people were genuinely sort of enjoying that ability to go back in and connect and get out of, in some cases, people living alone, in some cases, people living in flat shares. So that felt like we were going in the right direction, and that the world had changed and we would be more hybrid. We then had this sort of, and my vision at the time was that we would operate on a principle of 3 days in and 2 days out, with flexibility on what days they would be, and flexibility on, if you decided that it was going to be 2 days 1 week, that wasn't a problem. But at least it went from 3 to 2 rather than 2 to 1. And therefore you had the situation. I remember going in the office last summer and no one being there, and thinking to myself, well, what's the point? Because a few people who were thinking they were going to be there hadn't, or something had come up, and you're like, well, I'm going to just do what I could have done from home, except it's taken me an hour to get, in and out. Since then, I think what we've realized, and no small thanks to some of the kind of people you've spoken to on your podcast, and I'm an avid listener, and some of the things you've written about, but rather than then saying, right, well, this is the Tom Ellis view, which is we should go back in 3 days a week, we've basically said to people, look, let's use this chance to, the office is open. If you want to go back in, at various points, you can. And actually, a lot of the younger team are very much going back in on an occasional basis, whether that's because they want to catch up and do some work in a more collaborative environment with some colleagues, or just a change of scene. But actually, we're not saying it's 3 days or 2 days, or it's Monday. And then all what we've said to people is we've asked people what they want, and what's clear and reassuring for me, because I'm a big believer that the office has a role to play. What's clear is no one wants to be entirely remote, and no one wants to be entirely in the office. So finding that balance is then, a question of what's going on a particular week, what's going on with my team, what's right for me. I mean, the way we see it is what's right for me, what's right for my team, and what's right for my company. And we don't want to lose the company culture, because part of that is forged in all being around together, and that's motivating. We also don't want to lose the team dynamics, but again, we'll let them work it out, and we want to make it work for the individuals. But there are 3 moving parts there that are tricky to balance. So in essence, we've left it as a bit of an open book, and again, it comes down for us to trusting our people to figure out what works best for them and have the best interests of their colleagues and company at their heart, rather than just being purely selfish and saying, no, this is me, me or nothing. That's not the sort of people we kind of employ by and large anyway.
I wonder if I can just drill into a couple of things you said there, because I'd love to understand how they went through. So the first thing is you've mentioned that you're a company that's an innovations company, and sort of insights, innovations, the sort of aha moments, or delivering aha moments to clients, is a fundamental part of what you do. You've now had 16 months where you haven't been around each other. Have you, firstly, I wonder if you could give us an audit of that, of course, sort of, none of us want to say that it's been a disaster. Our businesses have still thrived, but yeah. I wonder if you could give us a perspective of what you've learned about innovation from that period of enforced absence, and have you had to create other ways to do it that maybe have given you a perspective of different methods? So that's the first thing I want to go into.
Yeah, great question, because I think, again, for the audience that we've got today, creativity and the sort of sparks of creativity, it's fundamental to what a lot of us do. So one of the hardest things, I think, is the, I think we hear a lot about the water cooler moment and this moment of serendipity, and some of it's BS. I mean, water cooler moments are not, by and large, great sort of ahas. What they are, I think, are quite often sort of sense checking with others, and an ability to bounce ideas off without, setting up a Zoom call, frankly. So I think some of those more informal conversations have been not lost, but have become harder, have become more transactional. At the same time, it's very easy to set up a call with someone and talk them through. And I've just been on a call with some colleagues where we've been discussing and arguing about, how a certain sort of creative framework for jobs to be done goes together. So I don't think it's suddenly massively harder because you're in different rooms. When it comes to kind of how you kind of facilitate that, I think what we've had to learn is it's not just a case of taking what you used to do face to face and putting it on, on Zoom. When we think about ideation workshops and things like that, we've learned that you can adapt to, and it took us a little bit of time, right? So again, full transparency for the audience here, we didn't start off perfect by any means, and I don't think we're perfect yet, but we actually utilized, I think, some of the advantages of being remote. And I used to hate that idea of running an ideation workshop with half the room dialing in from Chicago or something. But actually now you plan shorter meetings. So we are running something with a big multinational client, big sort of creative project, actually bringing 2 different companies together. And we've run it as a series of sprint sessions. So we've got almost 2-hour or 3-hour workshops every few days, but allowing that thinking time in between, where even if they're doing something else, ideas are still bubbling at the back of their mind, and we keep it sort of light touch on the homework. It allows us to move the thinking on as a core team. And so I think for the same investment of time that you might have in a 1 or 2 day workshop, actually, if you can stretch it out, and it allows different voices to come to the fore. And one of the questions I did see was about introverts and extroverts. And I think that actually, you know, a lot of anyone who's been in a kind of brainstorming ideation type workshop knows that the extroverts sort of rule okay sort of thing. And introverts who want to take a bit more time to consider and digest things often get kind of overwhelmed in those sessions and aren't able to contribute kind of as they might want to. I think these more hybrid ways of working, these more, I suppose, sort of stretched out timelines allow us to be more inclusive to those. So I think what it's forced is creativity in a different way. And what, again, I think we would look at going back is not that the old way face-to-face is bad and now the new way is good. And equally, we're not going to go away to a model whereby we would only ever do face-to-face. I think we will find that, and we know that there are things where being face-to-face is really nice to sit round a proverbial kitchen table together and sketch and discuss and banter. And sometimes that's sort of an easier way to forge an idea and forge that team. But actually, you know, if you can do a bit of that and a bit of the sort of longer term online work to go alongside that, I suspect you get a richer set of contributions and more kind of creative thinking.
Yeah, so to sort of dive into that then is my sort of follow-up question, because you've got a beautiful location in London that you've got, you know, it must be sort of a place, I've only seen it from the outside, but it must be a place that at the very least the location is such that, you know, it's a wonderful place to bring clients to, maybe to give them a sort of client experience with a group of intelligent people in the room. If you didn't have that office though, I think we've started to see a few American VCs starting to talk about their portfolio of firms and saying if they set up today, they wouldn't have an office. So if you were untethered from that, and I think to some extent, the office exists in two places. It exists on the map, and it exists in our memories, in our minds, doesn't it? You know, any of us from a certain age and generation have experienced so many things in the office that it immediately makes us long for a place, a location to recreate those. As a thought experiment, you've just given me some ingenious ways of how your company has adapted and actually taken advantage. I think the idea of brand sprints compared to these 2-day offsites, the way you've described it to me sounds, actually, this feels far more attuned to probably a constant flow of invention, and probably, no doubt, you'll do an audit and say that the work and the relationship is of a higher quality. If you were untethered from the office, do you think you would be saying today, we need less of an office, or we don't need an office, or our relationship with the office would look different? Or are you resolute? It's actually an unarguable factor.
It's a really good question. And one of the things on my list is actually about redesigning, redefining what the office is for, which will be news to some of the people on this call who are listening in from Brand Genetics. But I think we've talked about it a little bit as a, and I don't mean this in the slightly old-fashioned way, but a kind of clubhouse, somewhere where you come together and you meet and you use the facilities, and it's, you know, it's a pleasure to be there. And I think, look, WeWork is been riddled with challenges, but there was something in that sort of like, it's a cool place to go. As you say, we've got a great location, very easily accessible, lovely spot in the summer because we've got the kind of gardens to use and the like. And so we want to create an environment that people want to go rather than people have to go. And I think this idea of the sort of battery hen, you know, desks all lined up, that you know, actually if I want to your earlier point, get my head down and write a big kind of report or do some sort of real kind of, cold towels wrapped around my head thinking, home is a more conducive place for that. If I'm going to go in and actually, and I do a lot of thinking kind of in conversation, but if I'm going to do that again, whether it's a one-on-one or a bigger team, that dynamic, actually, Zoom 1-to-1 is great. Zoom 1-to-2, 3, 4 gets much harder because you get one voice. You can't have the little side conversations. You don't pick up people's sort of eye contact and it, so I think when it gets to those group conversations, it sort of falls down. So what we want to really provide is a place where people want to go because they're going to do their best work of a certain type, rather than where they're going to do the best of all their work. Because, part of your work is collaborative, part of it's heads down. It depends what role you're in. If you're an engineer, maybe it's more heads down. If you're a manager, often it's a bit more heads up and talking with people. So I think it will, for us, be about redefining what that office space is about and for. But I still think we would go and, find a home. And I do think there's something human, which is a big piece for us, human in having a home. It's the old hot desking thing. One of my colleagues, a number of my colleagues have got pictures up over their desk, silly cartoons, galleries they've been to, pictures of the family, whatever it is. And I think we like having a home rather than being entirely, itinerant. I mean, we all by and large don't want to move from hotel to hotel, and you could just live that way. But so yes, a long-winded way.
I wonder if I propose something to you now.
Yeah.
Because as a thought stimulus, I wonder if this got a value to it. And broadly, I'm going to sort of the office was a place of congregation. And, broadly, there's 5 functions of the office. The office was a place to meet people by appointment. The office was a place to meet people by accident. The office was a workshop for us to do our best work. And, when you've got clients coming in and, it's a showroom, a workshop. The office was a place of learning. And I think, really fundamental, we don't miss that. But the office was also a place of team cohesion, a place of congregation. Now, another place, and using precisely the same noun, but another place of congregation is churches and religious places where people go occasionally to be reminded that they are part of some broad group, some tribe, some social identity group. But they go there occasionally and they see that as, an episodic thing, that they might go once a week, they might go once a month, whatever they do, they go there. Now, the way you've described to me the function of the office there, the most fundamental part of the way you've described it to me is that the office is a place of team congregation. And so the immediate question that flows from that, and look, and you've described all those other things, I'm really intrigued in actually the way that you've brilliantly articulated that. But the office was a place of congregation. And then it just fundamentally poses the questions for us. Could we get more value from those moments of togetherness? Could we get more value from those moments of community? That rather than just saying, we're just going to go to a place 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, we are far more deliberate in the way that we do that. And in the manner of a church, that we create a service, we would create a sort of a gathering, or in the manner of a sporting gathering. Yeah. And, we share voice, either of them. And so, I just wonder if fundamentally there might be some bigger deconstruction that we might even be being posed with right now.
I think I'm not going to draw the analogies too far on the religion side of things, but I think there are, always people take their faith with them, right? And the church is a place of congregation. You may feel that you're, at your most Christian maybe when you're in church, or at your most Islam when you're in a mosque. I don't know. But I think that the challenge for companies, and again, just some of the questions I think is how do you, we aren't a religious cult, we aren't a sort of organization that, how do you imbue that into people? What's the equivalent of your your Sunday school, you go to a sort of religious school or something like that. And churches, well, in this country at any rate, and obviously very different around the world, but in this country, declining in church attendance and declining sort of religion has gone hand in hand. And I'm not sure whether it's chicken or egg, but I would, anyway, I'm not going to draw too far on that analogy.
Yeah, I'm meaning something far more secular. So I just mean gathering, and whether that is gathering at the altar of Liverpool FC, or whether it's gathering at the altar of Catholicism, whatever it is, it's just those moments of togetherness, especially when they're more structured, more deliberate. They are, the way Brené Brown talks about it, she talks about collective effervescence. When you've got these sort of moments of people mutually sort of drawing and providing energy to each other, then they can forge that togetherness. That I think a lot of us, if we were candid about what was actually happening in our offices last February, then there would have been a lot of depressive looking episodes and moments where people just sat all day getting on with their emails. They were living a life of semi-hibernation. They were going home. They were arriving at the office in darkness. They were leaving the office in darkness, punctuated only by a Boots meal deal. And, it was sort of this existence that I think in hindsight, we've now manufactured into, if every gathering felt like an episode of The X Factor. Sort of, there was lights, cameras, action, there was explosion, dancing, laughing. And, I'm not convinced actually that was the day-to-day experience. The interesting thing for me then, look, you're in a really competitive space. The space that your company operates in, I suspect anytime you approach a client, they've got a dozen other companies approaching them.
Exactly.
And so the question for you is, a thriving business, the question for you is, what are the things that would become a competitive advantage for you in sort of competitive set? So firstly, in one way, there's questions about recruitment here, there's questions about people development. All of those things are relevant, either as a prospective employer or as a current employer. What's the way that you make your offering appealing to employees? The second thing is, are there decisions that you would seek to make here that might somehow contribute somewhat to you having an edge over competitors? I'm so intrigued, it's such an erudite and thoughtful contributor. I'd love to know how you think about this.
Bruce, and here was I thinking you were going to give me all the answers, but listen, I think of those 5, and actually I put these to the team at a company meeting that we had. It was number 3. It was the workshop, fundamentally, that was the one we scored the lowest. Actually, the other 4, including learning, and I think that's a really important one, and I want to dive into that a bit, because including learning, that they actually all resonated for people as good purposes for the office. Now, we congregated in San Sebastian on, I think, March the 13th, 2020, as a sort of a reward. We had our best year ever in 2019. We took the team away. I mean, literally, we were out there and they started turning planes around from Spain. And, they were shutting San Sebastian around us. But we had a brilliant long weekend there with the team, a great celebration. And I think, frankly, we have been spending from that social capital, or at the very least trying to maintain it ever since. And it's been hard. Now, we've recruited 2 or 3 brilliant people. And I've been amazed how well they've hit the ground sort of running, especially for the guys who are coming in as a fresh face, and that they get it and they've learned brilliantly on the job. But I worry that, we're fine at the moment because our kind of mass, if you will, has been brilliantly bonded. They know the way everyone works. We have a sense of the company culture. We have a sense of our ways of doing things. And that makes it at least easier for that to be passed on, even if that's remotely. Now, if you're 20-something graduate coming out, fresh-faced, I think you get a lot of learning by osmosis. And I think being stuck at the end of a Zoom call or not getting on with, is tough, is a tough place to be. And so that's where I feel that, if we followed this model and just said, no, that's the end of the office, we're all going to be remote. And I know there are plenty of very successful companies that do that. But I think for the younger generation coming through, the people who don't necessarily know the job, that are fresh into it, and that's where we have a lot of talent that we kind of find. I think that's really hard, and I think it's hard for them to kind of understand some of the. It's not so much this is the framework or this is the way we think, but it's listening to a colleague on a phone with having a tricky conversation with a client, or just observing the way different team members interact. Somebody manages somebody. I think there's so much sort of richness and texture in that to not have it at all is sort of feels to me to be the biggest gap. And I think that learning and development piece is the thing that is probably one of the hardest remotely, not because you can't run training programs, and you can't do some great sort of more focused stuff, because we have, but is to try and just get that softer side of things, that feeling that I am part of this group, part of this team, that I can go out, and on a Thursday or a Friday, I can go and have a beer with a colleague or what have you. So yeah, I think that's really key. And I mean, again, I've seen a question from Sarah about that, Sarah Ordona, learning at home, and I think we've seen some others there. So I think that's a really hard thing. And if I had if there was a magic wand that said, look, if there's one thing that you could do remotely as well as you did in the office, what would it be? It would be that sense of how do you kind of get everyone onto the same page, and the learning and the way of operating and the understanding of kind of company culture.
So let's dive into, that's a good prompt for you. Let's dive in, Tom, and sort of maybe let's try and make sense of some answers to these questions. One of the questions here from Anna Kelly is that, what are the main differences between companies that have gone 100% flexible versus those that have opted for a more conservative approach? Well, I'm intrigued by this. Firstly, I think the things that characterize this is definitely the sectors. Banking, sort of investment banking has been a touch more conservative. Consulting seems to have been a touch more conservative. Broadly, I think, if you were going to choose an analog for it, industries that used to have more conservative dress codes have adopted a more conservative set of rules. I did some work where a correspondent in Australia sent me some details of how businesses in Australia were adapting. And one of the things that came out of the data that I crunched with her was that it seemed like the more male dominated. In Australia, you have to publish your gender balance by levels of seniority. Companies that were more male biased tended to be more rigid in going back to the office. So I think there are some things like that. I don't know if there's anything though. Have you seen in your competitive space, Tom, people using this as a point of differentiation? I think we are starting to see firms, in the technology space. Twitter have publicly said people can work remotely forever. And Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook has said that he will be working half the time at home. Slack have announced that managers need to spend 2 days a week at home. That's a really telling one. Because I think one of the things that we were aware of is that this presented a gateway, an opportunity potentially for eager workers to maybe to get more face time with bosses. If bosses were in every day and someone wanted to rise the career ladder, then conceivably it was career advantage. So that was an interesting one. Any that you've seen, Tom?
I think the observation on the leadership is spot on. I think those leaders who are very used to working in offices, have grown up that way, and frankly probably have enjoyed it because they are still there and they're leaders, so they've seen the advantages. I think that's absolutely the case. I think a lot of it to me, what I've seen in our clients more than anything has come down to that sort of sense of culture. You know, there are companies that we work with that are much more, I suppose, directive. I mean, I hesitate to say aggressive, but they're red type cultures. You know, they get stuff done, and I think they have been more dictatorial in what they're suggesting, whereas others have been a little bit looser. I mean, most of our clients operate in the sort of FMCG type space rather than the tech, and I think, for a lot of them, they've had sort of flexibilities of various different degrees, but I think the culture piece plays a role. So I don't think I can see any great patterns. I think your point about sector is definitely true, though. Sector and who are the bosses and what do they feel about it probably are the kind of big factor. Because a question from me, I guess, is what do people feel that we're losing? By saying to people, right, no, who is it? Jamie Dorman, and the head of Goldman Sachs, DJ Sol, David Solomon. What is it that they feel is fundamentally, that they've not had over the last year, that actually offering a little bit of flexibility, destroys? Why is it that you can't, even at those sort of places, say, well, it's 3 days in and 2 days out? I haven't yet kind of got my head around that. I don't know if you've got any insight on that.
Yeah. I think it's learned norms. I think, senior bosses, especially in those consulting firms. So you look, the consulting firms famously, you earn a formidable high six-figure salary, largely from doing a 14, 15, 16-hour working day. And I get the impression, one of the things that I saw that was in the verbatims earlier in the summer, earlier in the year, Goldman Sachs recruits wrote this sort of document to their leadership group, asking for some degree of flexibility in the way they were working and in the demands upon them. But one of the things that the pushback was that people wanted these recruits to work where they could see them. So that in fact, they were already frustrated that young recruits were taking laptops and going to sit under the potted plants in the office or sit in corners in the office. They wanted them to stay at their desk.
Right.
I guess it's just those learned norms. If you're, if you grew up having a milkman, then, the surprise of milk not being on your doorstep is something that you need to get used to. And I think that there's sort of that's a metaphor that definitely won't work for half of the continental. But these norms are something that possibly it's the paradox of this whole experience for me. We've had most of our working careers, and you and I, Tom, would definitely be long enough in the tooth to know this, that bosses have preached to us that, the mantra of working right now is that we're in a world of perpetual change. And yet one of the paradoxes of the last 12 months is the moment change has come to this management, this leadership class, they've felt deeply uncomfortable with it, which suggests to a large extent that, this is all about an axis of control. This is all about when things are out of our control, they feel threatening to us. They feel sort of injurious to our well-being. When things are in our control, we're very comfortable with them. I think it's just an important reminder that some degree of control is probably what makes any of us feel anchored in the jobs that we do.
Alan Jope was very interesting. He said, one of the things that Unilever had learned was that actually by empowering the frontline teams, you got, it sped things up, and actually, the pandemic was really a catalyst for them driving more ownership into the sort of frontline teams rather than this sort of hierarchical management structure.
Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. Was that something that he said directly to you, or
no? I mean, Alan and I don't talk all that often, I'm afraid to say. But I'm just looking it up. So he was asked sort of what lesson can you share from other leaders? And he said, I mean, this was early in the sort of pandemic, Unilever's pandemic response. And I captured it on my Evernote because I thought it was great. But we're actually moving away, he said, from scenario planning and trying to focus on building agility and responsiveness in the company. And I don't know that we should all be spending too much time locking in particular views or scenarios for future, but rather, and this is where it gets interesting, unleashing the trapped capacity that most big organizations have by letting go and letting people close to their markets, close to the front line, exercise their judgment and their decision making. And then this is the killer line, I think. We've discovered a new responsiveness in Unilever that I wish we had unlocked years ago, but it's taken a crisis to do that. And I think, you know, that...
Oh, fabulous. What was the source of that? Was that somewhere that people...
I'm gonna pop it in the chat. That was from
fantastic.
Bloomberg, a conversation he had with Bloomberg. There you go. Yeah, I mean, I just thought that, to your point about control, there was a leader, I mean, you know, hugely respected. Everyone I work with at Unilever sort of has nothing but good things to say. But it was that, you know, recognizing that if you're going to be agile and in the world of innovation, right, it's the sort of mantra of the time, how do you keep up? You have to let go of control, guys. And so I think that this has been an exercise in, you know, what we've learned really has been what was holding back hybrid working or working from home wasn't technology or legal constraint, because that's all sort of been handled, right? It was trust. And to your point, kind of control. And so I think, you know, actually the flip side of taking a hand off the tiller has been, if you've got people who have got clarity on the purpose, and I don't just mean that in a sort of, you know, a holier than thou kind of way, but a kind of what is your purpose as a team, as a business, then, and you let them crack on with it, and you've hired good people, then, hey, you know, they can move a hell of a lot faster than they might have in a hierarchical sort of structure.
I mean, it's so immensely appealing because it's got an adjacency to two things. Firstly, it's got an adjacency to your own discovery that actually, by breaking that 2-day offsite into little chunks, it seems to be you were getting more, the sum total of energy and insight and sort of progress you were making was more than the blocks if they were all together. But separately, I had a discussion with a couple of the early founders, the early recruits of Amazon, and I was really intrigued. Yes. A few of these chaps there's a couple of guys who've written a book. Forgive me, I can't remember the title right now, but it was like
Working Backwards.
Yeah, that's right. It was my last podcast episode. Yeah. Exactly that. And but I was really struck because I know how much BS sits in the origin stories of tech firms, and you know, anyone who sort of looks at any of the big tech firms and says we want to be innovative like them might ask themselves, you know, what has Google invented since it invented Google? You know, what has Facebook invented since it invented Facebook? And you know, a series of acquisitions and borrowed product features does not make innovation. Amazon, in contrast, has generated a lot of its new businesses from Amazon Web Services through to Amazon Prime, through to Kindle. It's generated them internally. And you know, the thing that really struck me, so I was just interested, were there any signs that they did something slightly differently? Yeah. And this book, Working Backwards, one of the things they said, and it's principle number 4 or 5 in there, it's specifically, it said that there was a feeling inside the organization that communication was at the expense of speed. And so the more time that people spent, and people maybe can empathize with this, more time that people spent in email and in video calls, the slower the company went. And so as a consequence of that, Jeff Bezos said, we need to find a way that teams communicate to each other by means of APIs, almost uncluttered, structured flows of data where we give metrics to each other rather than we allow individuals to come in. Now, immensely purist, whether it fully works or not, I don't know. But the way it was characterized was that it said we effectively want people to be the owners of their business unit, and for all the ability that enables them to make very rapid decisions. And I think sort of use the sprint mentality that you've talked about there. So these are really pleasing adjacency of those ideas, I think, you know, including your own, which suggests that maybe that's the critical thing we're thinking about right now. This may be sort of more orderly, long-term cycle. It's almost like a school year of us going through planning cycles and doing things that are based on the ways that we used to architect our work, maybe this is the fundamental change, that we're going to move to something that's far more nimble. And then those moments of congregation will look slightly different as a result of that.
Yeah. I mean, just a couple of questions, Bruce, that I think we should, as we're kind of and I know we could talk for hours more, but I think kind of advice to keep motivation high is a really good one. And I mean, if I can just spark a thought on that, because it sparks off what you've just been talking about. I think that giving people a sense of autonomy over where they work best and how they work best, within a framework maybe, but I think that's really empowering and exciting. And I mean, we all know there's another question from Richard about sort of introverts and extroverts. And, you know, people do work differently. They have different home environments. They have different, you know, personalities. They have different ways of tackling things. And I think that we, at the moment, you know, pre-pandemic, everyone was forced to basically work in the same environment that was probably created by the leadership in one form or another. And this environment gives people a little bit more flex and autonomy to do their best work. And I think that most employees want to be kind of feeling like they're performing at their best. So the more you enable that, the more motivated they'll be.
Yeah, most definitely. These no doubt different working styles that people will, you know, will want to adapt around as well. There's a question in there about gender, about, you know, will this enforced? I have to try and find the specific, but some companies are looking to have less flex as a way to ensure visibility.
I think that was Anna, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not convinced that that would ensure more visibility if merely we're just bumping into more women in the corridor. The evidence seems to be that the people who've strongly benefited from a degree less rigidity are people who've got responsibilities, care responsibilities, childcare responsibilities, and broadly that tends to fall disproportionately on women. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that a diversity and inclusion program, which is mandated on people coming into the office and seeing each other every day, would necessarily be more progressive than one where consideration is made of allowing people to work in a more flexible way. That seems to be the evidence. So that Australia evidence I published says that, you know, generally it was more male-dominated firms that wanted people in the office all day. Now, they may well use the excuse of inclusion for doing that.
And the other thing that comes up, and I think it is really important, is this sort of, and Labour in the UK have been talking about a right to switch off, but is that bleed when working from home? And let's face it, you know, we're not necessarily talking about working from home. It could be working from anywhere. But the bleed of, right, you're not commuting, so actually we're all putting in more hours. And actually, to some degree, productivity, I think there was an article from Tim Harford the other day saying productivity had dropped. You know, we're putting in more time and productivity's gone down. So how does that sort of work out? And I mean, do you have thoughts about how we do, I think Clemence has asked that, how we do sort of bookend days in a way that's fair and balanced?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, it's so fascinating because, like you say, if you increase the amount of hours and the product stays the same, then your productivity's gone down. And I think that's the challenge. The evidence that you and I exchanged an article before this, which was saying that, you know, I think a major report had said that productivity had suffered. So obviously, the way that we've been doing it in this exceptional circumstance has been suboptimal. You know, no doubt. The way that we've thankfully kept the lights on and somehow managed to sustain our businesses through this sort of terrible event hasn't necessarily been best in class on all metrics.
But
you know, so I don't think we should beat ourselves up on that too much. But no doubt there are going to be clues in the different ways that firms set about the next stage that will help shape the direction of travel. And broadly, I think if there's anything that I'm going to say is probably resolute, I would say that it's going to be increasingly difficult for firms to mandate 5 days a week in the office. Why? Because of the market effect. because we know that there's very strong evidence that when people can work remotely, or when they've got some degree of their home life being able to adapt to their work life or vice versa, it's got a monetary value to them. You know, we knew in the old days that people who could walk to work were willing to take about 15-20% less pay. And we see pretty similar figures, actually. People who feel that they can keep working flexibly are willing to take less pay. So there will be a market effect. Effectively, any firm that wants to have everyone in the office 5 days a week will be required, number one, to have more expensive real estate. And number two, will probably have to pay people more to come and do that. And the question immediately becomes, well, if you're trying to enforce that policy, it's like the wages policy of a football club. If you're trying to enforce that policy, then when someone leaves and you need to hire a new starter, are you willing to compromise that to get the candidate you want? And I suspect those things in aggregate will mean that there is a market effect suggesting that at the very least, people will get at least one hybrid day, remote day a week in most firms. And the really interesting thing for me is that I found that businesses that you wouldn't necessarily regard as the fulcrum of innovation, local councils, city councils, administration companies, they are often very willing to do it. I was really surprised. I did some consultancy with a couple of companies that ran call centers in the end of last year, and they told me that they'd always regarded that call centers were as close to factory work as knowledge work comes, and they said productivity had gone up for them by people taking calls at home. So, you know, I think some of the norms that we considered to be indisputable and inarguable, I think will probably reflect in a few years' time that, you know, there were some managers who were slower to evolve.
Well, Bruce, that is, as I would absolutely expect from you, a fantastic way to kind of bring this conversation to a close. I know we could talk for another hour answering some, we could talk for another hour. We could answer the questions for another hour. I hope we've touched on most people's points. It's such a big and rich topic and clearly sort of changing all the time. So Bruce, thank you so much for your insight.
Same, Tom. Like, always a pleasure to speak to you, and sort of, someone who's such a thoughtful person, a thought leader, right at the cusp of sort of doing these things is such an honour for me.
Oh, well, thank you, Bruce. I think all my thoughts come from some of listening to your podcasts, so I recommend it highly. It's my morning run podcast of choice. So tomorrow, guys, delighted to say we've got Xenia Tata, Chief Impact Officer at XPRIZE, in conversation with Merle Hall from Kinnear Dufour. Promises to be, again, another very rich, very different conversation, looking at kind of XPRIZE's global impact strategy. And then for those of you who want to cast your eyes forward a little bit further, on the 28th to the 30th of September, the second virtual edition of the Global Innovation Forum will be taking place, all around the topic of reimagining the future, which, as you can imagine, is huge. And we've got some wonderful speakers lined up: innovators, creators, designers, entrepreneurs, dreamers, you name it. As ever, the Global Innovation Forum team has brought them all together. So thank you for joining us, and just, good luck with everyone's sort of return to work over time, and battling our way through what remains of this pandemic. I think from both Bruce and I, we wish you good luck and good health.